disconnect. We welcome today Dr. Fred Mitchell from Northern Kentucky University. Fred, thank you for being here today and for talking about historic preservation with us. Everybody should take your class, Introduction to Historic Preservation.
Well, I appreciate that.
And you've taught it for we'll just say, many years.
A number of years, right.
And you are Mr. Historic Preservation in Cincinnati. And you want to talk a little bit about historic preservation in general terms and cultural resource management?
Sure. Yeah. Where do you want me to begin?
Do you see a distinction between those two terms, or?
Well, I think they're two different tracks in terms of historic preservation and cultural resource management. Cultural resource management primarily is where you have individuals that are within an organization that is concerned about the resources that they may either have a responsibility for or are of interest to their clientele. And then you also have the cultural resource management folks that do it for a living, primarily archaeology. And then dovetailed with that is historical investigation and architectural investigation. And really, the cultural resource management grew out of the need for professionals to be able to assess the built environment and the archaeological underground environment, whereas folks that would manage a historic home or a historic farmstead or whatever would be primarily concerned with that as a resource. But the cultural resource management folks take it to the step that is required for a lot of historic and archaeological compliance. And that's what really feeds a lot of the cultural resource management folk.
So basically what you're saying is that for our students in the public history program who may find themselves at a small museum and it may, or an historic house, they're not only going to have to be concerned about how do they do research, how do they market the place, how do they do exhibits, but also they're going to be the caretakers literally of that house.
Yes, they will. And they should arm themselves with the knowledge that they need to, first of all, understand what that resource is, be it a cemetery, be it a barn, a significant barn, to know what then is the opportunity and the procedure to be able to adequately undertake and perform work, as an example, that is not going to do any harm to the building or resource, but to be able to put it within the context of, okay, we're going to have to put a little budget going on over here. Also, what does this mean? Who's the audience for this? How is it going to help our patronage? But it is just an understanding of, okay, we've got this resource, we need to know about it, and we need to know how we're going to be able to manage it into the future.
And we want to avoid the big mistakes. So you probably remember many times in the 60s and 70s where contractors would come through and say to someone restoring a house, boy, do I have a deal for you. I'm going to sandblast your brick house. Yeah. And with the soft bricks of those time periods, they did a lot of damage.
And those soft bricks are still there. They may have the crust blown away.
Yes, they have the crust blown away, right.
But they are still there.
They are still there.
And there is much more information today, especially from the preservation briefs, as an example, from the National Park Service, than there was 40 years ago, where a lot of it was trial by error. Or there was a very good organization in Canada, the Association of Preservation Technology, which were really kind of the early standard bearers in terms of having knowledgeable, scientific type people that explored, measured, tested the results of the preservation techniques that were being used at the time. An example would be if you have some deteriorated wood at a window, and you don't want to replace the whole rail, but you just want to replace the deteriorated wood, what are you going to use? Initially, and even to this day, a lot of it is Bondo, auto body filler. That, depending upon your climate, can have a compatible expansion and contraction, winter, summer, with the wood. And they were doing all kinds of tests to determine what kind of projects, just as an example there, of the technology that was out there, the materials that were out there. And then in terms of PSI, pounds per square inch
Mhm.
pressure
Right.
for cleaning a building,
Uh-huh.
well, what's acceptable? I mean, is it what's coming out the end of a garden hose with your thumb over it?
Uh-huh.
Which with some preservationists, that's the way to do it.
Uh-huh.
Or is it 400 psi? 2,000? Never,
Uh-huh.
never anything that hot.
Uh-huh.
But people were coming up with standards for that, and today many of them are common, or formulations for mortar replacement,
Mhm.
which is kind of a little science in itself.
Exactly, because you want to make certain that it's proper mortar for the brick that you're using. Otherwise, you could certainly
Well, you're going to do more damage.
yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yes. You need to. The preservation philosophy being do no damage,
Uh-huh.
but yet you need to improve a situation. And if you're going to need to repoint, then the first thing is you need to do some kind of a mortar analysis for several reasons. One, to determine the constituency of the mortar, what makes up the mortar, sand, lime percentages. The next thing is to see how the tensile strength on
Right.
that. How tough is that? Color, texture, different sand, grades of sand with pebbles, straight sand. You need to assess the kind of sand that you're using, and then when you put it all back together in a new formulation, you need to be as compatible to the existing as you possibly can. And now I know too that you can be as compatible with that sample. And then you put it on, and then you're going to stand there and you go, oh, God, man, it just doesn't look right. Well, now don't forget, the sample that you've taken out
Is
is going to be aged.
80, 100 years old, maybe. We don't know.
Exactly. So let it sit there for a few years, as long as the strength is compatible.
Exactly.
Let it get a little smudged up and dirty. Atmospheric pollution is a great problem solver.
And so many times, what you're saying is do no harm. You're almost like a physician in all of this, and it has become very scientific and technical, just like medicine has. And I think, too, as we look at the human body or as we look at buildings, we can assume that as we age, things are going to go wrong, but things are also going to improve, hopefully, as well in some areas. Buildings the same way. Very oftentimes we will worry unnecessarily, perhaps, about something with a building and find out that some of these older buildings were very much overbuilt, really, for their times and can take a little.
Some.
Some.
The biggest danger to buildings today, in one form or another, from a conservation point of view, is water. Make sure you address all the water issues. If you've got a leaky gutter, don't let it sit there for 5 years dripping down all over the brick. It is going to dissolve the mortar. It is going to make the brick spongy. If you have an air conditioner, as a matter of fact, I saw this yesterday. Someone had an air conditioner on the building, and you could see where the hose was draining out,
Right.
and it was touching up against the building, and here's all this water all summer just coming down on the facade. And water pooling up around a basement, you can deal with that issue. Water is the worst
Culprit.
Exactly.
And if you've got a leaky roof, my oh my, the damage you can do.
and I have seen the damage. I have experienced the damage.
You have fallen through some of the damage.
I fell. A building had been. I was employed by the city of Dayton for a number of years to be their
Dayton, Ohio.
To be their preservation expert. So anytime that they had a problem building or one that was in compliance, in other words, going to be in the compliance procedure, that they were asking me to evaluate that building to see, one, if it was historic, and two, to make an assessment of would it be economically viable to rehabilitate the building. Making a long story short, we walk into the building, and I violated the first canon of going into a building. I had a building contractor with me. He went upstairs to the second floor, and he says, "Fred, come up here and look at this ballroom." Ran, walked up, but he was still on the stairs at the top. I was coming up. I got about 3/4 of the way up, and that staircase just let loose.
Oh my!
And it was a spongy staircase.
Oh.
And I knew it. And I said to myself, I don't want to go up there. We went up there, and boom, boom.
You didn't listen to yourself.
I did not listen
and
to
you
myself.
should never do this kind of stuff alone either.
Never. And you should always, if you are, tell somebody.
Yes, where you are.
Next door.
Yes.
And if you don't come back and tell them that you're out of the building, Provident Academy. Newport.
Newport?
I'm in the basement.
Yes.
I had to photograph it for a Tax Act project. I go into the John. The big heavy metal door shuts in back of me. Oh boy. Took me about an hour.
To crawl out?
No, to work my way. Fortunately, I had not a screwdriver, but a little rod bar in my camera bag. To this day, when in my camera bag, I have a toolkit.
Just in case.
With hammers and screwdrivers, just in case. And the other thing about buildings, too, is there are pranksters that will booby trap a building. You will walk in, and I've been into a lot of abandoned buildings. And you walk into the building and start to make your assessment, and somebody's got a carpet laid out, or there is a trash pile, or a cardboard box flattened out. You walk around it. You don't step on it.
Because you don't know what it's covering up. A massive hole or whatever. So you need to be very concerned about your own safety, obviously. And you need to make certain that you're working in the rehabbing of buildings with certified contractors and others you trust.
People are knowledgeable.
People are knowledgeable because I recall as Mother God Church had a fire back in the 1980s.
Yes, right.
And 1986, and a city engineer for the city of Covington looked at the dome of the church from the parking lot with binoculars and declared the building should be, it was unsafe, condemned, and torn down. None of us accepted that because in the case of large buildings like that, very oftentimes you will see the construction methods that show it was overbuilt. And so we called in an engineer from Columbus, Ohio, who had he had trained on old buildings in Europe. And he came, and of course he wrapped a rope around himself, and we made certain he was secure. He went around the inner part of the dome, which was all wood. It had an inner shell and an outer shell, and he took a bucket of nails, and he nailed it into the members to see how bad they had been charred. And he came down and he said, we have to replace one of the members. All of the rest of them are okay. He said it's overbuilt. It's if it got a bad sunburn. But obviously, he took all of the precautions. We took all of the precautions. But you can't always believe, say, you need to get a number of opinions.
Exactly. You get the best possible advice that you can get. And then work up a plan, work up a program, work up a budget. Work up who your experts, your contractors, whoever, how qualified, get yourself the right people for the job.
Now, you contract out as an expert in many different things, 106 and other kinds of reviews, tax credit, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you did tell me a story a few years ago, which I think is really good, about how you were working on what was then Cincinnati's tallest building, and I still say it's the tallest building, the wonderful Art Deco Carew Tower, and you needed to get some paint samples.
I needed to get a paint
sample. You proceeded.
Well, I got two paint sample stories. The first one is when they were doing the rehabilitation of the Netherland Hotel, that the architect wanted someone to do a paint analysis of the ceiling. So fortunately, the electricians had some scaffolding. So I scamper up the scaffolding, and it takes a little time to get some paint samples. And depends on how you do it. You can take an X-Acto knife and find a little place out of the way, and you can cut down to the substrate, and then just make sure you get it all intact, and put it put it in a little envelope, and then you put it under your 3D microscope. And so I'm working away, and this electrician comes in there and kicks the scaffolding. And it's like you're painting the Sistine Chapel, right? You're sitting up there, but all of a sudden it just starts moving and shaking.
Oh, yes.
And oh my God.
Tons of scaffolding were in the 90-foot, 100-foot or so of the dome of Mother of God. And we needed to go up and do the same sort of thing. Climb up, get the paint samples. And yes, and an earthquake occurred at one particular time. And the scaffolding was going back and forth, scare you half to death.
Sure.
Now, what was the other one?
Now the second one, Carew Tower again. If you notice, the top of Carew Tower is gilded.
Yes.
They wanted to know what was the procedure. What is it? So I'm up on the top, close to the top, up where there are some very narrow terraces up there, and open up the window and lean way out. And lean down, and I just, on the back side, just take a little chip and just knock it off. And subsequently found, one, it was terracotta on the back side, and then what they had done is that they had fired it with a white glazing, and then they fired a gold glazing.
On top of that?
On top of that. And there it is. If you're up in Mount Adams and you're walking down, on a Tuesday morning to go to work, and the sun is beginning to beat down, and the thing just lights up. It's amazing.
Wow.
It's absolutely amazing.
So who had to replace those pieces?
Well, what they wanted to do was, as part of the whole rehabilitation, not only for the Netherlands, but in terms of the Carew Tower, they it was the developers, and at that time it was. Well, it was still Emery Brothers, which subsequently sold out. But at the time, it was the Emery Brothers surviving organization. And if you know the Emerys in this town, very big real estate company, speculators in terms of, I counted, I remember I think in the 1920s they had almost 27 properties downtown. But as the transportation systems were going into the neighborhoods, they were building a lot of those apartment buildings that you see in Clifton or Walnut Hills, where a lot of the middle-class folk were coming out of the Basin area and coming up to the plateau, and then just settling up there.
Now, we discussed a little bit some of the criteria of, A, B, C, D for coming out of the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 for the National Register of Historic Places. You played a key role in the owner consent. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Prior to the way that it is now, is that you must have, for an individual property, you must have the owner's permission to get it listed in the register. For a district, you must have the majority of property owners. And if you are in a historic district and you own 2 buildings, you only get 1 vote. So prior to that, when all the rabid preservationists were beginning to run around the landscape of America, according to some people, just saying, nominating anything that's not tacked down, when I used to work at Miami Purchase, we undertook a nomination for Procter & Gamble's factory in St. Bernard.
In Ivorydale.
Ivorydale, right. Because it was a wonderful Romanesque industrial building, significant industrial history, and we let Procter & Gamble know that we were, pursuing this thing. they got a hold of the local representative, U.S. representative, who at that time was Gradison, and he invited me and a colleague over one afternoon to explain to them what we were doing, what does it all mean.
Mm-hmm.
Procter & Gamble thinking that they're going to have all kinds of federal regulations heaped on them,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a dynamic industrial machine,
Right.
the factory,
Still producing soap
and they have to
Mhm.
make changes.
Yes.
New technology comes
Mhm.
along. They have to be modernization. So we explained to Gradison what we were doing. And at the same time, there was this nationwide movement of a lot of other communities, especially when they were undertaking urban renewal, were all of a sudden confronted with 106
Mhm.
and assessments of the built environment and spending of federal money or licensing, all that stuff. So as it turned out, a number of representatives, not just Gradison, but a number, they changed the rules. And today, you must have owner consent or the majority within a historic district.
So that was
and
coming
if
out.
an owner objects an individual property, and it's a good property, it will be determined eligible,
Mhm.
but it will not be listed.
Be listed.
Now, it will be determined eligible for listing as it applies to any assessments for history of architecture that are required with the expenditure of federal money, or as in the case of, say, the Corps of Engineers or the Federal Aviation Administration. Anytime that they're going to build something or expand something, they must do historic architecture, archaeology surveys. And there are lists of what is on the National Register, what has been determined eligible. And that's just an initial list that citizens can go to, cultural resource management professionals, historic preservationists, everybody can tap into that list, usually at a state preservation office.
So let's assume that tomorrow they wanted to take a federal highway that was going to receive, maybe not a federal highway, but it was going to receive some federal funds through Ivory Dale, and it's not on the National Register, but it has been eligible. Still, we would need to do, correct, the 106 review.
If it has been determined eligible. Yes, you would have to do your historical assessment, your architecture, and perhaps in something like Ivory Dale, maybe a historic archaeological assessment.
So we could, and the end result of all that could be someone saying, okay, let's come up with a compromise plan here, right?
Well, what 106, the way that it was designed, was that you got the interested parties involved, which would be a federal agency that was supplying the money to the state of Ohio or the city of Cincinnati for the highway project. It would also be local preservation groups. It would be
the owner,
Procter & Gamble. It would be the State Historic Preservation Office, and it would be a representative from the Advisory Council, which is mandated by Congress as the federal organization. You have to understand how this preservation works. Preservation works in the United States because, from a federal point of view, because it is implemented by the National Park Service.
Right.
And the National Park Service has the National Register Office. And as part of the National Register Office and the National Park Service, you have this broader Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which oversees 106 compliance. Now it's done at a staff level mostly. But those are the interested parties. And they may put the highway in, but they may have to do a lot of studies, documentation. It's called a case report. In the old days, it used to be a case report. Where they would be required to do HABs, drawings, HAB standard photographs, document the history, archaeology, if it was any, architecture of the complex. Let's just say that they were just dead set on knocking down, 80,000 square foot building. That we have to have this for the right of way. It may come that they might be allowed to do that if it was lesser of significance. And then they would have to do this documentation. So remediation, in a number of people's eyes, is document the building. Now, they may not be allowed to do that. It just depends on what the situation is and what agreement the parties.
And who's going to pay for the assessment generally?
Usually, it is going to depend if it is a private company undertaking something, that they will have to do that. If it is the case of, say, a state highway administration,
they would have to.
They would have to do that. It isn't that you, as the owner of something,
right.
The onus doesn't fall on you. You're just sitting there. And then all of a sudden somebody wants to come and it's a taking. So, and it, hopefully it doesn't go to eminent domain.
Yeah, right.
Because eminent domain, as a frustrated ex-city planner, I know what eminent domain is, and I know today that it is misused. Quite misused.
As in Norwood, maybe.
As in Norwood, exactly. Exactly. Where when I was involved in eminent domain cases, it was usually acquisition of land for a park, acquisition of land for
hospital,
for a school, anything for the public betterment.
Yes.
Now the city of Norwood says the public betterment is raising the tax base.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court said that's a good idea. Which
is right across from Northwood Commons, where they, in fact, there was a house or two that had been remained and fighting in eminent domain, and they lost that struggle, and of course the new complex
is there right now.
Is part of, and so that can be, and you also have the city planning, and this is probably a good time to talk a little bit about your background, because you have the geography PhD, you have city planning credentials, you worked in city planning, historic preservation, teaching. Let's all go all the way back. When did you first become interested in old buildings?
First experience that I could really think of, I was an undergraduate, probably first or second year, and undergraduate was at Southern Illinois in Carbondale, rural area. Remember driving around the back roads one time and saw this dilapidated log building. So I took pictures of it, and I looked at the notching, and I thought, oh, gee, that's really kind of interesting. And what does this log building, what did it represent to somebody? What kind of habitation? Who were the people that were in here? What did they do? So that was a first experience. And then after I graduated in geography, started following professor for a while, about my third major. But I got interested in geography, primarily the broad spectrum of geography, which led me to cities and to the built environment development. And then I started paying more attention when I was, I'm from Chicago, so in Chicago in the suburbs, and I'm beginning to recognize a few older buildings, not knowing what the styles are, but I'm looking at the older buildings. And then I had to get a job, so I got a job as a city planner in Muskegon, Michigan. And lo and behold, they had a preservation fight going on in Muskegon.
And what year would this have been about?
This would be graduated 69, so it'd be 69, 70. And got involved in a wonderful city, in a job that allowed me to do a lot of different things in city planning, which was absolutely fabulous. And one of those things was getting these two buildings listed in the National Register, which, now remember,
was very new.
Was the 66 Act.
Yes.
And here in 69, looking at how we're going to do this, so somebody told me, well, this fellow at the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, he's the fellow that's been kind of tasked with dealing with historic preservation questions. So he came in, gave us a sense of direction, subsequently wrote a grant to do a citywide inventory. And then before that was implemented, I decided to leave.
Uh-huh.
So just to follow that scenario, I wanted to do rural planning.
Uh-huh.
Pull out a map. I'm already in Michigan, Lake Michigan. It's north. Why don't I go north? Why don't I stay on the lake? So here's St. Albans, Vermont, Lake Champlain, looking for a rural planner,
Uh-huh.
rural economic planning, in a county, by the way. At the time, 37,000 people. St. Albans was about 6,000.
Uh-huh.
39,000 cows.
More cows than people.
More cows than people. But next to Montreal, an hour drive up the
Oh,
road
wonderful.
is Montreal. So, I started looking, especially looking in Vermont and New England at continuous architecture.
Yes.
As
all
a-
the way back to colonial time.
As a vernacular form,
Mhm.
where you had the house itself, the barn, the breezeway. So all year round, you didn't have to go outside in the winter. In the summer, you take the shortcut
Uh-huh.
in a rainstorm, whatever, get to the cows, do what you need to do. But then in Montreal, first time I ever saw European architecture in the old town of Montreal. Then got to Quebec City and just fell in love with Quebec City.
It was an old French city.
And the defensive wall, defensive mechanism. And then as it turned out, I was able to get a master's degree in geography at University of Vermont. And then I took a job in city planning at South Burlington, where I was the director there. Muskegon, when I left Muskegon, I was the assistant director there. So I got a job as a director in South Burlington. Very political.
Uh-huh.
And I looked at my desk one day and I said, I don't want to be a city planner anymore because this is what city planning is going to be. Muskegon was great, but South Burlington, no. So I looked at my desk and there's a bunch of stuff on historic architecture. Picked up the phone, called this fellow that I knew working for the National Park Service, the register office in Washington. And I says, John, you got a job for a frustrated city planner down there? He said, no, but I'll tell you what. Somebody in Cincinnati, local preservation group of Cincinnati, is looking for a guy just like you. So I called. Came down for the interview. The old Miami Purchase.
Miami Purchase, which is now Cincinnati Preservation.
Cincinnati Preservation. At the time, had just received about a $75,000 contract from the city of Cincinnati to do the historic inventory of Cincinnati. Now understand, I don't know historic architecture. I don't know anything about a preservation organization. All I know is city planning. So I come down, and part of the interview was Bruce Getzman.
Uh-huh.
Who was a very knowledgeable historic architect.
Yes.
Very good guy. And Bruce and the executive director and the president, Tracy Kropp.
Tracy, right? Mm-hmm.
Tracy, yeah. And they explained what the job is. And they said, don't worry about not knowing architecture because there's an architectural historian on staff. You're not going to be involved in archaeology. We got 2 archaeologists. They had a staff of around 9 at the time.
And that was on Dayton Street
That was at,
in the West End.
812 Dayton Street.
812 Dayton, the old Houck House.
The old Houck House.
And this would have been 1980.
This was 75.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
In 1975.
Okay, 1975.
At a time, urban renewal,
Yes.
the Albee Theater
Yes.
lawsuit, across the United States, urban renewal money is changing the character of neighborhoods, of downtowns, and Miami Purchase wanted to get ahead of the game by saying, you people of Cincinnati, you really need to understand what you have and the spatial extent
Right. Of how
of
large.
where
Yes.
it is.
Yes.
So they said, you got the $75,000, you do whatever you need to do. So they decided to hire a frustrated planner. And that's what brought me to Cincinnati.
That is a very interesting story. And you mentioned some of the early preservationists. And of course, Bruce Getzman at the University of Cincinnati associate it with the College of Design, Architecture, Art and Planning.
Sure.
DAP, we call it,
DAP,
DAAP.
right. Yeah.
And I would meet him a few years later, along with Margot Warminski,
Margot,
who is also, she's sort of Ms. Preservation.
Very, very knowledgeable.
And-
Great writer.
And she and I went to school together at University of Cincinnati.
Now, your input, though,
Was Bruce.
was also Zane Miller.
Yes, Zane Miller.
I mean, as an urban historian.
Absolutely. And Bruce Getzman, Bruce was just fabulous on historical architecture. And of course, he had his own firm involved in preservation, involved in the Cincinnati Hotel, the old Palace Hotel downtown. Right. And I think that the Fire Museum, so many wonderful buildings. So you were very much on the cutting edge of preservation. And can you talk just a little bit about historic preservation theory? Now, there are some people that are very much orthodox, conservative people. Don't tear it down. It's 100 years old, and the termites are holding hands, keeping it together. You're not that kind of a person. You're kind of like me, very middle of the road in your understanding. And part of this, I guess, is your work with companies like the American Can Company, and how can we make this building suitable for whatever purposes we need and still make money.
Right. Okay. A couple of things to that. First thing is understand the level of expertise as late as the 1970s, from 66, you invent the historic preservation wheel across the United States. Where are the spokes? Where are the people that are going to make this thing start to spin? You're not pumping out a lot of architectural historians. You do have a lot of archaeologists. Conservation technology is in its infancy. So and the way that program is managed is that Congress, through the National Park Service, sends money to the states that all have historic preservation offices that get funded in part with the preservation money. And there are young, energetic, altruistic people that start to work in these preservation offices. Ohio was somewhat different because, yes, they had the preservation office, but they had regional preservation offices, of which part of my job when I came here was to be the regional preservation office for the 4 counties in southwest Ohio. But if you look at my counterparts, one was a retired English teacher. One fellow you didn't want to go to dinner with because he was always shouting at you, and he was a retired artillery colonel.
Oh, no wonder he shouted. He had hearing problems.
He had real bad hearing problems. Another one was Eric Johansson out of Cleveland. He was a professional historic architect. Little old ladies in tennis shoes.
And blue hair.
Blue hair. Oh, the blue hair babes. Oh, yes. They were the ones screaming and hollering, trying to say stuff. You learn architecture. You go into neighborhoods. You try to get the neighborhoods involved. They have their little organization, and it is common folk. The great people that just love historic preservation. They really just love buildings. They didn't understand the historic preservation process. Now, your question. There's an economic point, to me anyway.
An economic breaking point.
Yes, about buildings. Now, maybe the time isn't right now to rehabilitate a building. That's a second issue. Maybe you can mothball a building, forestall it a little bit, have the building inspector just kind of ease up a little bit, which the city of Cincinnati does allow the building inspector to make some assessments. If it's not a threat and danger to health and safety, mothball the building. The notion of adaptive use. Okay, we can't use the building for its original purpose.
Like a church anymore.
Exactly, but we might be able to do something to get some other activities in the building. American Can Company, you had mentioned, was a building with the preeminent can manufacturer. The building is in Northside. The building was rehabilitated for market rate housing. But this is an industrial building soaked with oil, PVCs. You got to clean this building up. Additional costs that the developers didn't think about. Many times, to do a very good, sympathetic, being honest to the building rehab, you need a developer who's been around the block, who knows historic preservation, who knows the value of historic preservation.
And how much it's going to cost to do the cleanup.
Exactly. And also in terms of the developers of the American Can Company building are great of working with the neighborhoods, of getting the neighborhood involved, of letting them know the steps that
and
they're
energized.
Exactly. And Bloomfield Schoen and Partners is the name of that developer. They have subsequently taken over the Kirby Road School.
Oh, wonderful. Which is also Northside.
In Northside. As a matter of fact, that just got listed in the register about 3 weeks ago.
And a lot of this is happening because of the historic tax credits, and which
yes.
Began later on in 76.
76.
And then
as a 25%
right.
Investment tax credit. Today, it is a 20% investment tax credit.
So can you explain a little bit? I buy a building for $200,000, and I have to pump $2 million into it.
Okay.
It was an industrial building, and we're going to take it and we're going to make some retail market rate housing, etc. What am I looking like in terms of what I can take 20% of the $2 million?
Subtract the cost of the land out of there.
Okay.
And then a couple of things. A building needs to be listed in the National Register.
Okay.
Either as an individual building
or part of a district.
Or determined that it is a contributing building to the historic district.
Versus non-contributing. Okay.
And there are forms that you have to fill out. What you need to do then is that you need to see that you meet the adjusted basis. So that adjusted basis is what is the cost of the building and the land, subtract the land out. Okay, whatever cost that is, that's the minimum amount of money that you need to put into a building.
Okay.
Okay, so $2 million, no problem.
Okay.
In meeting the basis.
Okay.
Then what you have to do is this. You need to follow what are known as the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. That is the benchmark. These are the preservation briefs. You need to articulate in a form that is getting more complicated to put together, let me tell you.
How you're going to meet those standards.
First of all, what is the existing condition of all of the major elements and some significant minor elements, if there is such a thing as significant minor element. You have to describe the existing condition. Then you say, this is the way that we propose to address that. Even if it's just cleanup, rehabilitation, you're not doing anything out of the ordinary. But maybe you got a roof problem. Maybe you got a leaky basement. Maybe you have a building, as in the case of Kirby Road School, that has an auditorium. Proscenium Arch Auditorium. You're not just going to go in there and chop that up for apartments.
Right.
They're not going to let you.
Yes.
So you need to kind of figure out, okay, these are the standards. I need to adhere to these standards. I may not do everything that I want to do because, as an example, in the auditorium, there's a large vaulted space, flat floor. They wanted to chop it up into 3 market rate units. They went up for their initial review.
This is the preliminary or the initial review.
This is the initial review.
Which you've got to get, otherwise you're not going to sink $2 million into
at
it.
the State Preservation Office.
Okay.
They go over the draft application.
Okay.
They look at your plans. A couple of weeks later, they'll get back to you
Mhm.
and they'll say, yeah, preliminarily that may look good, but you're going to have to change this over here.
Mhm.
So they had to change the auditorium.
Mm-hmm.
So what do? They primarily say, we're going to use this auditorium. It's just some community space.
Yes.
And we're just going to clean it up and all of
Mhm.
that, but it's not going to be an active, viable
Mhm.
plan. They would have liked to put apartments in there, but they're not
Right.
able to. So you do all of that. And then at some point in time, your application gets a nod from a state preservation office. They are the clearinghouse.
Mhm.
That, all of your documentation, plus you need photographs of all existing conditions, exterior, interior, whatever. Your plans are existing plans, demolition plans,
Mhm.
proposed rehabilitation. All of that goes to Washington, gets reviewed there. Let's say it gets approved.
Mm-hmm.
It is only preliminarily approved,
Right.
which says you can go ahead and now use the Secretary of Interior standards, do your mortar, do your paint analysis, do whatever you need to do to turn this building around. And yes, we will let you do it as an addendum. Classrooms,
Mm-hmm.
put apartments in them.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what you're going to do? You got to keep the chalkboards.
Mm-hmm.
You got to keep the
Lockers.
well, not lockers, cloakrooms.
Cloakrooms, okay.
So how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can put a kitchen in there, as long as it's the tangible evidence that it was a school.
Yes.
Keep the interior halls, keep the volumetric space, do whatever. So then you do the rehabilitation. Can take you 5 years.
Yeah.
You can go up to that. And then what you need to do is you need to close the project out.
Mm-hmm.
You take after photographs.
Mm-hmm.
You send it up. Okay, great. You did what you were supposed to do. Here's a letter we're going to give you. You use it with the IRS.
Okay.
Here is the letter that says that you have qualified for the 20% investment tax credit. For some developers, that is great. For some developers, they don't need the tax credit.
Mhm.
So what do? They sell it.
Okay.
They sell it to somebody else. Are they going to get 100% value? No. Are they
Mhm.
going to get 92 cents on the dollar?
Maybe.
Perhaps. 94? Perhaps. And statistics are being published now every year as to each state as to how much money is generated because of rehabilitation and the utilization of the historic tax credit.
And it's amazing.
And it's going up and up and up every year.
And it's meeting also the kinds of tax incentives we're offering for new construction and new developments as well, which is part of the idea
Of course.
that
yeah.
that you can't keep building as we have been building in this suburban sprawl, that it's not a sustainable
It is not.
environmental model.
And you may have buildings where the energy has already been expended in bricks,
Mhm.
in roofs, in floor beams. It's all there. I mean, the wonderful thing that is going on right now is the rehabilitation in the Over the Rhine.
Yes.
The rehabilitation that has been going on in Covington, in Newport.
And this is amazing. When you started here in the 70s in
It was
Cincinnati.
it was an echo.
Yes.
We would be sitting there hollering, "You've got the greatest collection on both sides of the river of
Italianate building.
architecture in the United States."
And it was people like you and Bruce and the Miami Purchase Association and Zane Miller telling all of us that. And yet we're seeing the turnaround
And, I mean,
just now.
It's taken 35
Yes,
years.
35 years.
It's amazing.
And still the sad story is the west end of Cincinnati, which
Oh,
still
yes.
closed. I mean,
Yes.
Miami Purchase, in fact, is no longer on Dayton Street.
Well, they are.
Well-
They've gotten the Howe House back.
Oh, they have gotten the
Yes.
healthcare. Wonderful.
Yes, from Southwest Ohio.
So, but still, that whole neighborhood could
Is-
be redeveloped, restored.
Efforts have been made.
Mhm.
Since I worked there in 1975, there's been an increasing number of demolitions.
Mhm.
In the Over the Rhine, when we did the National Register nomination for before they go over the Rhine. We mapped out every building. Someone a few years ago went through that map and found that there was just a tremendous amount of demolition.
Isn't it amazing?
And so basically, it's fantastic what they're doing, but you can drive up a few of those streets, and they're beginning to put infill housing
In, right.
in there, and they're trying to make it compatible, scale,
and size, right?
Fenestration, balanced, symmetrical, asymmetrical, whatever. Window levels line up with the building next door, hopefully. And the development community has gotten the idea. A lot of people like 3CDC, which is the large developer.
Right. Kind of non-profit.
Non-profit,
yes, non-profit.
Supported by a number of organizations, businesses, etc. You talk to people in the communities, you talk to people who know preservation, and they got a little fight going on. Because 3CDC, on the whole, has rehabilitated buildings. Sometimes they're going to demolish a few buildings to make a larger building or to put an infrastructure parking lot for a number of buildings. And a number of folks are saying, just address the building. Work with the building. Work with the exterior of the building. Oh, and that's the important thing about the register. Your students should know this. Generally, most buildings are placed on the register because of the exterior of the building. There are a number that are because of the completeness
of them interior-wise.
Of the interior as well. So it all depends on how you write your nomination.
Exactly. What you choose.
As to what you are saying is significant about this building.
Fred, I think it's an honor knowing you and other people like Bruce who have turned Cincinnati around. You have been the pioneers. If you had to identify, other than housing stock right now, what we really need to worry about over the next 20, 25 years, and otherwise we're going to lose if we don't preserve, what type of building would that be?
Two types.
Okay.
I
think you're going to say the same things I'm going to say.
Okay. First one I'm going to say, and not necessarily prioritize.
Yes.
Is railroad vernacular architecture.
Yes.
Which is generally owned by the railroad.
Yes.
And they could care less. So what used to be a part of a yard complex, or the part of a suburban station, or a siding,
are falling apart.
The other one would be industrial buildings.
Industrial buildings.
Exactly. That's what I would choose. There is a wealth of fabulous industrial buildings.
I would add, I was going to say industrial and churches. I think what we don't realize, we have many churches that are historic in Cincinnati, Protestant and Catholic, which when you look at their size, the sizes of their congregations are holding on by a thread. We're going to see so many of them close in the next 5 to 10 years. And they're part of our landscape, our cultural landscape, our historic landscape. And if they ever disappear, and they're also very expensive. Having been involved in Mother of God, I know these are expensive to maintain, expensive to heat, expensive to air condition. But sometimes we have these wonderful adaptive reuses, and then all of a sudden you have, like the monastery on Mount Adams, where is it today? It was adaptive reuse and all of that. I want to thank you very much because you are such a knowledge base for us all. And I want to end up with one thing, if it's all right. And you said that one time you ran across, I think it was in the southern United States, man who had a big plywood.
Yes.
Can you?
Yes. Yes. Getting back to the philosophy of historic preservation now. My wife and I are driving through Arkansas, visiting her parents, and we come into this much smaller town. And we just get into the town, and this person had taken a 4x8 sheet of plywood and had placed on there a homemade sign, "My house is not a museum," or "My home is not a museum." And I went, whoa, man, that's interesting. So we stopped in the town and started talking to people, and there was a historic preservation fight going on in terms of getting local control, local zoning, and then design control over an area where this person had his house. And his house was not a museum, but it was a fine little Italianate, wonderful little Italianate. Maybe there was some misconception. Maybe that if you get yourself listed in the register, you need to open your house up. Maybe if you get yourself listed in the register, people are going to be standing there on the sidewalk taking pictures of your house. Yes, they do the second. No, they don't do the first. Your house doesn't have to be open. But there's a lot more education. There's a lot more advocacy that needs to be done to educate the general public about the intricacies beyond understanding an architectural style. How do you preserve the building? What's the political world that you may have to go into to get a local historic district ordinance, subsequent design control? What are the economics of working with older buildings? The unfortunate situation is that with the historic tax credit, it only applies to buildings that are used for income-producing purposes.
Yes.
Now, state preservation offices and state legislatures are now giving state tax credits, Kentucky being one of them, for individual property owners.
And also local governments are offering.
Local governments as well. So there are now becoming more individualized homeowner programs. But I still think that there's still this educational need.
Oh, absolutely. And the minute you are the kind of giving person who, if someone asks you a question, you're going to be supportive of them, you're going to be truthful, you might say to them, well, that may not be worth your while, or that is very much worth your while. But we are kind of curators and advocates, right, for historic preservation.
All the time.
And we never want to get to the point. I actually was going to bring Mother of God Church some years ago, Carolyn Pitts, who was the head.
Oh, that's an old voice.
Of the National Park.
Old name from the National Park Service?
From the National. She was the head of the whole thing.
Yes.
She came to Cincinnati, and I brought her over to see the Cathedral Basilica of the Assumption and Mother of God, and she said, you need to go for National Landmark status, which is the next level up.
The highest.
For Mother of God. She said not for the Cathedral Basilica, because she saw more integrity and especially the interior of Mother of God. Well, there were political reasons in the church at that time when the Catholic Church was undergoing a lot of Vatican II changes to the insides of the building. They were afraid. So just this year, I brought it up to Marty Perry at Kentucky Historical. He said, here is who you need to call at the National Landmark Office. And I sat here with a colleague and felt as if I was 2 cents waiting for change, because we had this conversation, and it was very much a condescending conversation of, well, there are plenty of churches. I had sent information already to him so I could talk. There are plenty of churches like this. I grew up, one person said, in Pittsburgh. We had a church around the corner. And I think sometimes that happens with academic historians. But the wonderful thing about public historians like us is we realize that not only do we need to advocate and not discourage people, but we need to educate.
Oh, yes.
And you said two very important things: educate and advocate. That doesn't mean that we say that this is a great project if it's not. But we certainly are encouraging people to move in that direction. Thank you for spending the time. Is there anything you want to say to wrap it all up?
Well, I would just encourage your students, one, to be mindful that there is a significant built environment out there. It doesn't necessarily is all composed of Italianate architecture, Queen Anne, industrial buildings. The thing that I like to leave with my students is keep your eyes open. When you're stuck at a stoplight, look around. Start to see how a community has developed. Look at the buildings. In your own lifetime, you have seen change.